What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. If the combination isn't for you, I've got some links down in the description, but for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. On a hot August night back in 1955, in the small town of Money, Mississippi, a tragedy occurred that would shock the nation and ignite a movement. And the victim of this crime was 14-year-old Emmett Till. Emmett was just an innocent boy from Chicago visiting his family when his life was viciously and cruelly and unjustly robbed from him. His brutal death and the aftermath that followed ultimately forced the country to confront the ugly truth of its own racial violence. His name, once known only to his family and his friends, soon echoed in courtrooms and in churches and in classrooms across America. I know that my high school history class covered Emmett's story, but I think now more than ever, our country needs a reminder because, as we know, those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. Emmett's story isn't just about a single isolated crime. It's about the world that made his death possible. It's about his mother's courage, and it's about the community outrage that would ultimately help to reshape the course of American history. This is the story of the death of Emmett Till, a turning point in the civil rights movement that exposed the depth of racial violence in the American South and set in motion national conversations about racial injustice. All right, so to kick off today's story, we are first going to be heading to the Windy City, known for its agriculture, its music, and its sports.
The Bears!
We are, in fact, kicking things off today in Chicago, specifically Chi-Town, circa the 1940s. Now, by the time our story takes place, slavery had technically and legally been abolished for just over 100 years. However, as we all know, or at least we should all know, Jim Crow laws emerged basically immediately after slavery was abolished as a way for white Southerners to maintain a racial hierarchy similar to that of the pre-Civil War South. You know, God forbid human beings get to operate on a level playing field. Just the horror. Simply put, the end of slavery sent certain white people scrambling to try to protect their beloved way of life. Their disgusting, racist, bigoted, self-aggrandizing way of life. Jim Crow laws were more or less just a continuation of slavery. Yeah, white people could no longer stake ownership over Black people, but these laws swiftly came in and created a new system of racial segregation and discrimination. Under Jim Crow, Black people were systematically denied equal access to schools, to public spaces. They were denied voting rights. They were denied jobs. And that's barely even scratching the surface. Buses, trains, restaurants, theaters, parks, swimming pools, bathrooms, water fountains. Quite literally everything that you could possibly think of was separated, and it was subsequently designated for use by only specific racial groups. And sure, the white people of the time toted these facilities as separate but equal, but let me be perfectly clear. Facilities and opportunities for Black Americans were far inferior. And girl, you better never be caught in or caught using or even caught looking at the white facilities if you were Black. These laws were enforced primarily through a combination of intimidation and violence. Like, these white people would lynch you first and ask questions later for something as simple as using the wrong drinking fountain. Truly, it was fucking barbaric. So understandably, the Black people that could manage it at the time, they got the fuck out of Dodge. Between 1910 and 1970, approximately 6 million people relocated from the South to northern states in hopes of escaping racial segregation and marginalization and the violence that was taking place in the South. And while these droves of people relocated to many different parts of the country, spanning all across the Midwest and Northeast and the West, I believe primarily the most common destinations were Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, California, and you guessed it, Illinois. Chicago, in particular, was seen as sort of a promised land throughout this time frame. It offered higher wages and improved living conditions and a sense of progress and community. Better jobs, better homes, better schools, all of this was beyond enticing. However, I think most enticing of all, Chicago offered a reprieve from the harshness and the brutality of the deep Jim Crow South. Hence the aforementioned millions of African American people who did decide to make the move from the rural South to these more northern and western city environments. And amongst one of those waves of people was a young woman named Mamie. Mamie Carthan was born on November 23rd, 1921, in a very small and very rural town in Mississippi. Mamie was the only child born to her parents, John and Alma Carthan, and as I'm sure you can imagine, this was a very scary time to bring a child into the world as a Black couple living in the South. So pretty quickly after Mamie was born, her father, John, decided that this wasn't the life that he wanted for him or for his wife. It especially wasn't the life that he wanted for his daughter. He wanted to leave this deep South nightmare, and he wanted to move his family north, where he hoped that they would be safer and that they could be happier. And after finding a job at the Argo Corn Products Refining Company, John was able to fulfill his dream. He was able to move his family north to Argo, Illinois, which is where Mamie would then spend the rest of her upbringing. At the time, Argo was a small industrial town located about 13 miles outside of Chicago, and in comparison to where the Carthans had come from, it was a much safer and much kinder place to live. And Mamie truly did seem to thrive there. Shortly after her 18th birthday, Mamie met an amateur boxer named Lewis Till, and after a whirlwind romance with quite a few ups and downs, the two ultimately tied the knot on October 14th, 1940, when they were both still just 18 years old. Shortly after their wedding, Mamie found out that she was pregnant, which she was completely over the moon about. However, not only would Lewis never know their child, but his and Mamie's relationship also soon began to completely fall apart. From allegations of Lewis's infidelity to further accusations of physical abuse, ultimately, Mamie had no choice other than to file for a restraining order from Lewis. And although the order was granted, without so much as batting an eye, Lewis would violate it time and time and time again. He violated this court order so many times that a judge finally got fed up with him, and he told him that he could either go to prison for these violations, or he could enlist in the army. And in order to avoid jail time, Lewis opted for the latter option. Eventually, Lewis would be shipped off to Europe as an army private during World War II. And from that point on, Mamie never saw Lewis Till ever again. In 1945, she would receive a letter from the Department of Defense informing her that Lewis had been killed in Italy due to willful misconduct. And although Mamie never got like a full rundown of what specifically Lewis had done, it would later be discovered that he was actually executed via hanging for raping 2 women and murdering a third during a home invasion. So suffice it to say, it's probably not a bad thing that he was out of the picture prior to having any real impact on his son. Emmett Lewis Till was born happy and healthy on July 25th, 1941 at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. Lovingly nicknamed Bobo, Emmett instantly became the absolute apple of Mamie's eye. She loved that child more than her very own life. She was fiercely protective of him, and she was determined to give him every opportunity that she had ever been denied. Eventually, Mamie and Emmett relocated from Argo to Chicago's South Side, and from what I was able to gather, it truly seems as though Emmett was incredibly happy growing up with Mamie. He was sweet, he was loving, he was respectful, he was kind. He did contract polio for a bit when he was 5, and although there is not technically a cure for polio, with the right treatment, it is survivable. And Emmett did just that. He survived the virus, he pushed through the complications, and aside from being left with a slight stutter, Emmett went on to be a completely normal child. He loved telling jokes, he loved playing baseball, he loved reading comic books. He was warm and playful, and he was eager to please people, and he was quick to make you laugh. He loved his friends, and he loved his family, and he would have done just about anything for anybody. Truly just a sweet, amazing, selfless little boy. Growing up in Chicago, Emmett was fortunate enough to be shielded from some of the harsh realities that his extended family back in the South still faced. However, that is not to say that this city was completely free of prejudice, because it certainly wasn't. It's just that in comparison, it was significantly better. In Chicago, Black children could attend integrated schools, they could ride on public buses, whereas in the South, they could barely even walk down the street without the looming threat of violence. So you best believe that in 1955, when Emmett asked to join some of his cousins on a trip to Mississippi, Mamie made sure that her son understood that the South was nothing like Chicago was. Mamie had desperately wanted Emmett to go with her on her trip to Nebraska that summer instead of going on the cousin trip to Mississippi, but Emmett had his heart set on spending the end of the summer with his cousins and in Mississippi. And so, over the weeks leading up to both of their respective trips, Mamie did do her best to try to teach her son how to keep himself safe. Basically, she had to try to teach him how to tiptoe around these people who would have loved nothing more than to find a reason to hurt or even to kill him, just because of who he was and what he looked like. And believe it or not, based off of what I've gathered from hearing my friends' experiences, from hearing experiences of Black creators across all different platforms, and even given things that I've seen and heard through pop culture, I think I'm safe in making the assumption that these conversations are still having to happen to this day. Black parents or parents with Black children still feel as though it is necessary to teach their kids these things to this very day. And that is because, as shameful as it is to admit, racism is still incredibly prevalent and it is still incredibly widespread throughout our country. I can't even begin to express to you how much I wish that wasn't the case, but I think we all know that it is the reality. Circling back to Emmett though, like I said, Mamie did everything in her power that she could possibly think to do to make sure that her son was prepared and that he was educated on how to conduct himself and how to properly and safely navigate the South. She emphasized the importance of saying yes ma'am or no sir if and when he found himself being addressed by a white person. She warned him not to look a white woman in her eyes, and she told him that if he had to, he needed to step off the sidewalk and to lower his head if a white person approached him. Truly, it is unbelievable the hoops that Black people had to jump through just to stay safe back then. But Mamie was well aware of this, and she did everything she could, later recounting these talks as, quote, a crash course in hatred to a boy who only knew love. And although she was certainly nervous, I can't imagine that she would have sent Emmett on this trip if she didn't truly believe that he was going to be fine. He had assured her that he would be fine. He assured her that he understood the things she was telling him. Sadly though, neither of them had even the slightest clue that when they said goodbye at the train station prior to their trips, that they would never get the chance to see each other ever again. That would be their final conversation. It would be their last hug. Mamie loved that boy more than life itself. And the next time that she would get to see him, he would be in a coffin. Emmett was headed to Money, Mississippi, and no matter what his mom taught him or what he thought he knew, he had absolutely no idea just how dangerous and how truly hateful the people in the South at that time could actually be. Money, Mississippi is part of what is known as the Mississippi Delta, otherwise known as the most southern place on Earth. And while the vast majority of the people who lived in the Delta at the time were Black, nearly all of the land and the wealth and the power was all held by, you guessed it, white folks. And these white people maintained the rigid social order of their land through unimaginable violence. They kept these innocent Black families trapped in poverty or in debt, all under the threat of punishment, be it economic or physical. The threat of violence or even of death was never far away. Local law enforcement and the courts were also dominated by white officials, so punishment was swift and it was brutal for those who were perceived to have broken these rules. And horrifyingly, this was the world that Emmett Till was walking into in August of 1955. A world where race determined your place and where crossing invisible lines could have deadly consequences. Emmett was so excited to be on this trip and to spend time with his great aunt and his great uncle and to hang out with his cousins. Sure, the heat was relentless and the environment was foreign, but regardless of that, the trip started off fantastic. That is until Wednesday, August 24th, 1955. Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market sat at the edge of town. It was owned by Roy and Carolyn Bryant, and their small little store's main demographic was the area's Black sharecroppers and their children. And on this night in particular, Emmett and his cousins had stopped into the market to grab some candy and some sodas, just like dozens and dozens of Black folks had since they opened the store. However, what happened next, not only would it devastate a family, but it would ultimately bring about nationwide attention to the racial violence and injustice that was running rampant throughout Mississippi. And what's really crazy about that is that what actually happened, that's been the subject of debate for decades. Although Emmett was mostly only inside the store alongside his older cousin Wheeler, after the boys had checked out, Wheeler did exit the store before Emmett, leaving Emmett inside for moments alone with the store's shopkeeper. Tending to her and her husband's store that day was 21-year-old Carolyn Bryant. And I think what's most widely believed to have happened during that short time was that Emmett had whistled at Carolyn. However, realistically, Emmett could have done so little as to simply make eye contact with this horrible woman, and this whole story, honestly, might have played out the very same way. Now, Emmett's cousins would corroborate that at one point they had heard him whistle. However, Carolyn Bryant would weave together a much more elaborate and a much more egregious story, especially given the timeline that we're talking. According to Carolyn's story, she claimed that once alone with her, Emmett had grabbed her hand, that he had made some lewd remarks, and that he had threatened her. Mind you, Emmett was in this store alone with Carolyn for such a brief moment. To think that he had time to do all of these things is preposterous. And his cousins, who were sitting just outside the store on the porch playing checkers, never heard anything like this take place. And again, they were just outside and they were 100% within earshot. So if they were able to hear a whistle, I have to assume they would have been able to hear any sort of potential altercation. Yet all they heard was this one single whistle. And that's because nothing else happened. Emmett did not grab Carolyn. He did not make suggestive remarks towards her. He didn't threaten her. That is an objective fact, which we'll get into later. So recognizing this exchange for what it was, a simple whistle, that is what we're working with here. And despite how it may have been interpreted, I don't think that this whistle had anything to do with Emmett being disrespectful or trying to flirt with Carolyn Bryant. According to Emmett's mom, because of the stutter that his polio had left him with, his speech was oftentimes sort of unclear. So to combat this, Mamie had actually taught Emmett to whistle softly to himself before pronouncing certain words that he found to be difficult. In particular, Mamie said that he had a hard time pronouncing anything that began with a B, And considering that he was in the store to buy bubble gum, he likely whistled simply to himself to help him with his articulation. However, because weasel-faced Carolyn thought that she was just all that, she immediately jumped to the conclusion that Emmett was stepping out of line. Basically, the takeaway here is that Carolyn fucking Bryant was a disgusting piece of human garbage. She was a pathetic loser who wanted so badly to be desired that she made up a ludicrous bullshit story that in turn got a 14-year-old boy murdered. So pardon me for saying that I hope to whomever you believe in that she is roasting in hell's hottest little corner, just burnt to a miserable crisp and begging for mercy that will never come. Truly, she's smart to have had her ass cremated, because if I could, I would make it my life's mission to spit on that woman's grave. She is truly a monster of all monsters, just a rancid cunt of a woman.
Did something just happen? I think I blacked out there.
Now, admittedly, when everything first went down at the store, Emmett and his cousins were a little freaked out. They knew that whistling at or even near a white woman was basically a violation of these unwritten rules in the area. So yeah, in the moment, they were scared to death. They couldn't get out of there fast enough. They grabbed their stuff and they took off. They hauled ass back to their car and they got out of there as fast as they possibly could. But when nothing came of this encounter for the next couple of days, truth be told, they pretty much forgot that it had happened altogether. However, tragically, down in the Mississippi Delta, old codes of retribution still ruled. And unbeknownst to Emmett and his cousins, a massive storm was brewing. Money is a small town, so it did not take long for word of what Emmett had supposedly done to Carolyn to start to spread. Within a matter of hours, it had become the town's hottest, juiciest gossip. Everyone was talking about it. So when Carolyn's husband Roy and his half-brother John, when they caught wind of what had happened, well, they simply could not let it go. Roy had been working out of town when the quote-unquote incident had taken place, so he actually didn't find out about it right away. But when he got home and someone else told him about what had supposedly been done to his wife, he would not let that slide. As far as he was concerned, this was an unpardonable offense. What kind of man was he if he stood by and he let this happen to his wife without defending her honor? So come hell or high water, he was going to make this little boy pay. And pay he would. It was just after 2 a.m. on August 28th, 1955, when Emmett and his cousins were jolted awake by a crazy pounding on Emmett's aunt and uncle's door. And when Emmett's uncle answered the door, none other than Roy Bryant and John Millam stood there on the porch. They were armed, they were furious, and they were there to take Emmett. They stomped into the house straight past Emmett's uncle, and they began tearing through every single room in that house looking for Emmett. And when they did, at gunpoint, they forced him to get up, to get dressed, and to leave the home with them. Despite the pleas of Emmett's uncle and his cousins and his aunt, I don't think any of it mattered to them. The Wrights, Emmett's aunt and uncle, they even offered Roy and John money not to take Emmett, but I don't think anything could have stopped these two Neanderthals from following through with what they had planned. They drug Emmett out of the house, they threw him in their truck, and they drove away. And I cannot even begin to imagine how scary this must have been for that poor child. He has heard nothing but horror stories about white people in the South. And after listening for weeks leading up to this trip, hearing his mother beat into him just how dangerous these people truly were, I cannot even imagine what was going through this poor child's head as these sorry excuses for men abducted him like this. And when they threw Emmett in the truck and he saw Carolyn sitting there, I feel like he probably knew exactly why this was happening. And it is just devastating that no matter what he did or what he said, there was likely nothing he could have done to save himself. To clarify, along for the ride that night was Roy, Carolyn, John, and another man named Johnny, whom Roy and John had essentially forced to help them. Johnny was actually another black man, and my guess is that he was likely told that he was going to help them with their plan, not so much asked. I imagine that he likely felt as though he had no choice but to comply. Regardless of that though, Emmett was ultimately taken to a barn on the outskirts of town. This barn was owned by John's brother Leslie, and over the next several hours, these men put Emmett through unspeakable and frankly sickening torture. They weren't just looking to punish this boy for what he had supposedly done. They wanted to make an example out of him. Emmett was beaten, he was tortured, and he was humiliated. Not only was he beaten within an inch of his life, but he was beaten to the point where he was almost unrecognizable. He was beaten so severely that one of his eyes dislodged from its socket and almost all of his teeth were knocked out. He was whipped and hit and punched for hours. These monsters beat and broke this child. And then when they were finished, without so much as an ounce of remorse or without a second of hesitation, these sick fucks shot Emmett in the head above his right ear, killing him instantly. Once he was dead, they took his body to the bank of the Tallahatchie River, and once they were there, they proceeded to then use barbed wire to tie a 75-pound cotton gin fan to Emmett's neck before they threw him in the water. Absolutely reprehensible. Meanwhile, back at the house, just after Emmett was taken, his uncle Mose had the unfortunate task of making a gut-wrenching phone call to Mamie to tell her what happened. And as I'm sure you can imagine, she was beside herself. Not only had her boy been kidnapped, but she's like 1,000 miles away in Nebraska on her own trip. So it's not like she can even quickly get there to try to help him. Not that it would have mattered in the long run, but just the helplessness she must have felt. I mean, Mose and his wife Elizabeth, they did everything they could possibly think of to try to track Emmett back down without endangering their own lives. But sadly, it would be days before Emmett's body would finally be discovered. It was early in the morning on Wednesday, August 31st, 1955, when a man who was fishing in the area made a gruesome discovery. Emmett's bloated, battered, and barely recognizable body had finally floated to the shore, and now this man was staring straight at it. By this point, word had started to spread, as it does in a small town, so it didn't take long for officials to deduce who this boy likely was. And ultimately, Emmett's uncle Mose was called in to identify his body. What is truly devastating, though, is that likely no one could have identified Emmett just based off of his looks at that point. He had truly been beaten to the point where he was completely disfigured and completely unrecognizable. The only way that Mose was able to identify Emmett was thanks to a silver ring that had been left on his finger. This ring, engraved with the initials LT, had previously belonged to Emmett's father, and it was actually, I believe, the only possession that Mamie had to pass down to Emmett from his dad. Emmett hadn't taken that ring off for the entirety of his trip. So now standing there and staring at this body and staring at the ring on its finger, Mose knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this boy in front of him was Emmett. His nephew was dead. He had been lynched at just 14 years old for simply coming into contact with the wrong, awful fucking woman. And when Mamie was informed that her son had been found and that he was gone, despite the unimaginable and incomprehensible pain that she was in, she refused to fall apart. She demanded that Emmett's body be returned to her in Chicago, where she intended to make her own example out of what had been done to her son. Now, obviously, the authorities in the area were trying to convince her to allow them to bury Emmett, no doubt in an effort to conceal what had happened to this innocent boy right under their very own noses. However, Mamie, she was having none of it. Not only did she want to see what had been done to her son, but she wanted the world to see what those barbarians had done to her child. And I think the good old boys down in Mississippi could tell that this was not going to pan out well for them. They tried to tell Mamie that they would only agree to send Emmett's body back to her if she agreed to have a closed casket funeral for him. And so, knowing that it was the only way, Mamie agreed. Little did the officials in Mississippi know that Mamie, she had absolutely no intentions of honoring that agreement. Nope. In what has since been referred to as a profound act of defiance and of activism, Mamie made the courageous decision to have an open casket funeral for Emmett. Despite how deeply personal this was to her and how emotionally taxing it was, she famously stated, quote, "Let the people see what they did to my boy." And you guys, Emmett's body was in such terrible shape that even the funeral home tried to dissuade Mamie from going through with the funeral under these terms. But she refused to back down. She understood the power that she had in this moment, and she understood the weight of this decision, later stating, quote, "I knew I could talk for the rest of my life about what happened to my baby. I could explain it in great detail. I could do all of that, and people still would not get the full impact. They had to see what I had seen. The whole nation had to bear witness." Emmett's funeral was held at Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ in Chicago, and according to a news article published about it, approximately 50,000 people attended the service, with an additional 100,000 people coming through to view his body over the following couple of days. According to a reporter from the Chicago Defender, these people were there to see Emmett, to talk to him, and to swear to him that they would never forget him. And in order to ensure that truly no one ever would forget her son, Mamie actually decided prior to Emmett's service to allow photographer David Jackson of Jet Magazine to come in and to photograph her son's funeral, as well as to photograph his remains. These harrowing images were then subsequently printed, not only in Jet, but they went on to be reprinted in Black magazines and Black newspapers all over the country. You know where they were never printed, though? To my knowledge, I don't think a single photo of Emmett's funeral or of his body was ever printed in a single white media publication throughout this time frame. Because, you know, these people didn't want to actually look at what was being allowed to be done to innocent Black people. And not just Black people now, but Black children. Newsflash, if you can't even stand to look at the repercussions, maybe it's time to take a good hard look at how you have your fuck-ass society set up and running. Despite this, though, despite people trying to avert their attention and to ignore this story, the violence of Emmett's murder, coupled with the courage of his mother, it forced America to confront the true horror of racial hatred in the South. And because of Mamie, and because of how hard she truly fought for her son, the world would never be the same. Roy and John's trial began in September of 1955, just a couple of weeks after Emmett was killed. It was held in the Tallahatchie County Courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi, and although this is a very small town, the even smaller courthouse was packed to the frickin' rafters. Family and friends of the defendants, as well as reporters and activists and just random locals, filled every seat in the segregated gallery. Emmett's story had taken the entire country by storm. So boil that down to just Mississippi, people were divided. People were pissed. People were scared. Tensions at that courthouse were so high that armed men had to be stationed outside in order to watch what was going on and to try to keep the peace. Witnesses, including Emmett's Uncle Mose, bravely testified, risking their lives in order to identify in court the men who had taken and had killed Emmett. Truly, speaking out like this against these powerful white men, it was incredibly dangerous. One witness, Willie Reed, he testified to having seen the men at the barn and to having heard Emmett's screams. And while his testimony was compelling, it terrified him so much to show up in court and to speak out against these men that he ended up having a complete nervous breakdown. He quite literally had to be snuck out of Mississippi following his testimony. We're talking witness protection style, snuck out in the dead of night in order to relocate to Chicago and to safety. Devastatingly, though, despite the overwhelming evidence, the defense painted a contradictory story. A story where Emmett was the aggressor and the men were more or less just defending themselves. They also tried to argue that the body that had been pulled from the river might not even be Emmett. Because his body was so bloated, they said that his body looked more like that of a grown man than a teenage boy. So to them, who was to say that Emmett wasn't still alive and just, bebopping around Mississippi somewhere? Ludicrous, I know. In response, though, Mamie herself got on the stand and she set the record straight. On September 22nd, 1955, Mamie stood under oath and she unwaveringly identified that body as that of her son. Because who on earth could identify your body better than your own mother? When all was said and done and they were excused for deliberations, it took the all-white and all-male jury just 67 minutes to return with their verdict. And on September 23rd, 1955, Roy Bryant and John Millam, they were both found not fucking guilty. Yes, both of these horrible men were acquitted. They never spent so much as a minute in jail or in prison for what they had done to this poor, innocent, sweet little boy. And to add insult to injury, just 4 months later, in early 1956, these two asshats went on to brazenly admit that they had murdered Emmett. They admitted to everything they had done, just so they could be featured in a magazine article. The magazine had offered to pay them the equivalent of almost $50,000 in today's money for this story. And I guess they figured, what do they have to lose? They knew they were protected by double jeopardy, so all they saw out of this was a fat payday. Following their acquittal, they could have sang from the rooftops that they were guilty, and nothing could have been done to them. Well, I guess not technically nothing, because we've seen cases like Mel Ignato and, who was it? It doesn't matter. Point is, I've covered other cases where perjury charges do come into play in situations like this one, but let's be real. Nobody was going to come after these two guys for anything else related to Emmett's death. There was talk at the very least of them being charged with kidnapping or something else other than murder, but when push came to shove, they were never re-indicted. It is so unbelievably unfair, and it's so sickening and it's disheartening that these men did this and then they were allowed to just walk away scot-free, and then they got to brag about it. They didn't even see a slap on the wrist for brutally and mercilessly murdering this boy in cold blood. During his closing argument, defense attorney John Whitten Jr. had addressed the jury, stating, quote, "I'm sure that every last Anglo-Saxon one of you men in this jury has the courage to set these men free." And as disgusting as that statement is, he was right. I mean, not about the courage thing, because what these men did was as cowardly as it gets, but he was right that these white men would do exactly what they always had. They stuck together and they chose racial solidarity over what was right. They chose it over what was so clearly right in front of them. Truly, the multiple ways in this story that Emmett was failed, it makes me sick. Thankfully, though, I will say that Mamie Till is a much stronger woman than I. Because while this outcome, of course, enraged her, rather than letting it destroy her, she let it fuel her. The acquittal strengthened her resolve, and in turn, she became a tireless advocate and a relentless activist. She spoke out at rallies, she participated in interviews, she stood tall, and she put her foot down. She refused to let her son's death be forgotten, and she refused to let him die in vain. She turned her private grief into public action, and her courage, as well as the media firestorm that followed, it inspired an entire new wave of activists. Emmett's murder was not just a Mississippi tragedy, and it even far superseded Mamie's devastation. Emmett's death was a national reckoning. As images of his face and the story of his murder spread, anger turned to action. And just 95 days after Emmett's death in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white man. And when she was later asked why she had done this, she simply stated that she had thought of Emmett Till, and after that, she couldn't move back. And from there, Rosa Parks' quiet defiance, it ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, an event that's widely considered to be the catalyst for the civil rights movement. Across the entire country, young activists, as well as seasoned, lifelong activists, they mobilized. Their outrage over Emmett's murder and the blatant injustice of the trial, it fueled their demands for change. Organizations like the NAACP, they saw a massive spike in membership. Demonstrators took to the streets, and people all over the country demanded an end to segregation and to racial violence. Many of the most prominent figures from the civil rights movement, people like Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, John Lewis, Rosa Parks, they all cited Emmett's story as a turning point in their own activism. It was the fire that ignited their demands for change. And yeah, a lot has changed since 1955. Laws have been written and rewritten, and barriers have come down, but I think we can all agree that there's still a lot of work to be done. Progress isn't necessarily linear, and it's fragile. I think that's obvious now more than ever. So it's important to continue to share these stories and to never forget names like Emmett's or like George Stinney's, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. I mean, the list goes on, and that is devastating. It is so unbelievably important to keep these memories alive so that each generation can confront the past. That is the only way that we're going to be able to move forward together and to build a more just future. Mamie dedicated the entire remainder of her life to fighting, not just for justice for her son, but for justice and equality for all Black people. She spoke at rallies and at protests, and she shared Emmett's story any chance that she got. She never stopped fighting for or advocating for civil equality or for civil rights. She toured extensively with the NAACP. She co-authored an autobiography titled The Death of Innocence, the story of the hate crime that changed America. And on top of that, she worked as a school teacher in the Chicago public school system for 23 years. She found every possible way to use her real and raw experiences to educate and to mentor young people both in and out of the classroom. Mamie did ultimately remarry. She married a man named Gene Mobley, whom she shared her life with for 43 years before he sadly passed away in 2000. Mamie herself then passed away from heart failure in a Chicago hospital 3 years later in 2003. She was 81 years old when she died, and until her final breath, she never once slowed down in making sure that her son's memory lived on. She's now buried next to Emmett in Burr Oak Cemetery, with her tombstone reading, quote, "Her pain united a nation." And as for the other three people in this story, please know that I use the word people loosely because, in my opinion, Roy, John, and Carolyn are subhuman. I have more respect for the fruit flies stuck in the Zevo trap in my kitchen than I have for these ingrates. But in the interest of wrapping up the story, you'll likely be happy to know that John and Roy both died agonizing and painful deaths, each following their own respective bouts with cancer. John kicked the bucket in 1980, and Roy followed him straight to eternal damnation 14 years later in 1994. And unfortunately, that does indeed bring us right back around to the broad that started it all. Carolyn fucking Bryant, the human equivalent of an ingrown toenail. I loathe this woman to my very core. I can't express to you enough. So let's start with the positives. Well, positive, singular, because there's only one. And it's that she's dead. She dead, she gone, she died, she ain't living no more. Rejoice.
Hallelujah! Holy shit! Where's the Tylenol?
Annoyingly, she did only just punch her ticket back in April of 2023. She actually died on my husband's birthday that year, and I can't really explain it, but for some reason, I love him a little more because of it. At any rate, though, this horrible, vile woman lived to be 88 years old. Just a reminder, she was 21 years old when she crossed paths with Emmett, and trust and believe she spent the subsequent 67 years acting just as fucking ridiculous. When all was said and done, she and Roy went on to have a couple of sons before they ultimately parted ways. Because I guess couples who lynch together don't stay together? Who'd have thought? Once they called it quits, Carolyn went on to remarry 2 separate times. Once in 1984 to a guy named Griffin Chandler, and then again 4 years later in 1988 to a guy named David Donham. According to her Find a Grave page, she died as Carolyn Bryant Donham, so I'm guessing that she wrote out most of the rest of her miserable life with David before he died in 2002. In 2007, author and historian Timothy Tyson interviewed Carolyn for a book that he was writing about Emmett's death, and according to Tim, Carolyn recanted her story about what had happened between she and Emmett during this interview. Evidently, she told Tim that she had gotten the story from a Southern racist horror movie called The Black Beast, and in actuality, Emmett had never threatened her or disrespected her at all. I mean, obviously, we already know this, so it's no real shock to us. The only shocking thing about this interview was the portion where Carolyn allegedly stated that nothing Emmett could have ever done to her would have justified what, in turn, happened to him. Ah, finally. Something that this she-devil and I actually agree on. Don't get too prideful of her, though, because that awful witch later stated that she never said anything like that to Tim, and her surviving family also continues to maintain her original story. They claim that Carolyn never, at any point in her life, lied or wavered about the account of what had happened between her and Emmett. The following year, in 2008, Carolyn published her own book titled I Am More Than a Wolf Whistle, the story of Carolyn Bryant Donham. And when I tell you that I would rather drag my bare ass across a mile of broken glass than ever crack open that book, I could not be more serious. Frankly, I don't need to. I already know that Carolyn Bryant is more than a wolf whistle. She's also a racist and a liar and a bitch. In June 2022, an old arrest warrant for Carolyn was actually found at the bottom of the old filing cabinet in the LaFleur County Courthouse. Evidently, old girl was almost charged with kidnapping back in 1955, but for whatever reason, the warrant was never served. In early 2023, surviving members of Emmett's family filed a federal lawsuit seeking to compel authorities to serve the 1955 warrant on Carolyn present day. However, the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Carolyn then died just 2 months later.
Isn't that sad?
Across the country, Emmett's story continues to be taught in schools. It's preserved in memorials, and it's continuously revisited in books and in film. In Sumner, Mississippi, the Emmett Till Interpretive Center stands just across from the courthouse where Roy and John were acquitted. And beyond that, scattered throughout the Delta, there are a number of historical markers that also help to keep Emmett's story alive. Some stand proud and pristine, while others bear the scars of bullet holes and graffiti, which is just so heartbreaking. Thankfully, every time a sign is defaced, it seems as though local activists or local students quickly restore it. And by doing this, they're proving to anyone and everyone that Emmett's memory cannot be easily destroyed. As it would seem, progress and resistance continue to live side by side in that area. Honestly, they live side by side in the entire country. Emmett's story isn't just a chapter in a history book, and it's not just a story on a podcast. It serves as a warning that echoes through time. All these years later, yeah, things have changed, but headlines sort of haven't. Black people's lives are often still treated as disposable, and justice still remains selective. Families are still too often left begging to be seen as equal. The same fear and heartbreak and the same desperate calls for change are still so prevalent today. The circumstances that led to Emmett's murder, they're so woven into our society today. We relive history every time a person of color's life is unjustly taken. Yet people still try to look away and to say that it's not happening like that and that everything's fine. Yeah, maybe racism today isn't as loud or as obvious, but it's still everywhere. And in my opinion, over the last couple of years, it seems to steadily be getting worse. It's built into the fibers of our school system, our jobs, neighborhoods, the justice system. It shows up in who gets pulled over and who gets hired, who feels safe to walk down the street and who doesn't. Tensions simmer in protests and in hashtags and in uncomfortable conversations that some people would rather try to avoid. And despite years of progress and promises, the lived reality for many is still shaped by prejudice. Too many people still live under this veil of suspicion and inequality, all because of the color of their skin. And in my opinion, this begs the question, how many times do we have to let history repeat itself before we finally break this cycle? And if by chance you look like me and you're headed down to the comments to cuss me out or to tell me that I'm being too political or to tell me that racism and white privilege aren't real, if the topic of racism as a whole makes you uncomfortable or makes you feel defensive, I challenge you, instead of taking it out on me, to sit with that discomfort. I challenge you to own it and to ask yourself where it's really coming from and why you are truly feeling this way. Rather than fight it for once, maybe lean into the discomfort and really try to boil it down to the root cause. The only way that we are ever going to see any real change is if we're willing to listen and to reflect and to confront the truths that some people would rather ignore. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to poor Emmett. At just 14 years old, his life was stolen from him in the most barbaric and the most brutal way imaginable. He was simply visiting his family when these grown adults decided that he didn't deserve the opportunity to grow up himself. Bear with me on this next part because it's hard for me to put what I'm feeling into words here. I have a complicated relationship with religion and the whole afterlife, heaven and hell thing. But regardless of that, I hope that somehow Emmett and Mamie were able to see each other again. I hope she was able to hug her son again and to see his face again in perfect shape, the way that it was before he was killed. And somehow, I hope that Emmett knows that he helped change the world. I hope he knows that his mother never gave up on sharing his story and that because of her strength and her courage, even 70 years later, the entire world still remembers his name. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. I am so thankful that so many of you requested to hear this story after my video on George Stinney, because this case has stuck with me for years. So I'm glad to finally have the chance to share my thoughts and my feelings on the situation. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all the links and the information for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week, but if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then, though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! Ultimately forced the country to confront admittedly, Emmett's cut. If I say Emmett one more fucking time, and once they were there, they used And once they were there, they proceeded to use I can't say it. Use. Not used, use. Okay, this is the one. In Chicago, and according to the news article, seasoned lifelong activist. Mamie herself then passed away from heart failure, and until her every time with the I. John kicked the bucket in 1980, and Roy filed. Thank God I fucking pushed through. That was a fucking doozy and a half, people. Doozy and a half, my friends.